Welcome to the Massachusetts Multicultural Film Festival, now in its 29th season, presented by the Film Studies program at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, Barbara Zecchi, director. I'm Daniel Pope, director of the festival, together with Sean Shimpak, and with the help of our assistant curator, Nefeli Forni-Serbutaki. Laura McGough curates the 2022 MMFF with the theme Indigeneities, presenting a season of global contemporary Indigenous film and media art. Tonight's event is made possible by a grant from the 5 colleges' Native American and Indigenous Studies Mellon Fund. It's a true honor to welcome Sky Hopinka to discuss his debut feature film, Małni, Towards the Ocean, Towards the Shore, tonight. For the conversation with Sky Hopinka tonight, I'm pleased to present Jacqueline Urla, who provided the evocative introduction to the film for the festival. Jackie Urla is a professor of anthropology and dean of the graduate school at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She's done research on language revitalization and has taught courses in both visual anthropology and linguistic anthropology. At UMass Amherst, she served as chair of anthropology, director of the Modern European Studies program, and the interim director of the Film Studies program. And Dr. Urla curated the very first edition of the Massachusetts Multicultural Film Festival with the theme, The Shock of Recognition, Identity, Memory, and the Politics of Representation in Indigenous Media. Also joining the conversation is this year's curator, Laura McGough, who will lead and moderate the Q&A. Laura McGough is a media art historian, curator, and practitioner. She's curated exhibitions, screenings, and web-based content for arts organizations, museums, and film and media festivals throughout the United States, Canada, Australia, and Europe. Dr. McGough also served as the multidisciplinary and presenting specialist at the National Endowment for the Arts. She holds an MA from New York University and received her PhD from the Department of Media Study at SUNY University at Buffalo. Our filmmaker guest tonight is Sky Hopinka. Born and raised in Ferndale, Washington, Sky Hopinka of the Ho-Chunk Nation Pechanga Band of Luiseno Indians spent a number of years in Palm Springs and Riverside, California, Portland, Oregon, and Milwaukee, Wisconsin. In Portland, he studied and taught Chinuk Wawa, a language indigenous to the lower Columbia River Basin. As an artist, his video, photography, and text work centers around personal positions of indigenous homeland and landscape, designs of language as containers of culture expressed through personal, documentary, and nonfiction forms of media. He received his BA from Portland State University in liberal arts and his MFA in film, video, animation, and new genres from the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. He currently teaches film and electronic arts at Bard College. Sky, Jackie, and Laura, welcome.
Thank you, Daniel. Sky, welcome again to the Massachusetts Multicultural Film Festival. We're so pleased to have you here to discuss your debut feature film. It's such a rich film, visually, thematically, and there's so much to talk about. So let's jump right in. Jackie, I'm going to ask you to kick off tonight's conversation.
Great. Thank you, Laura. And thank you, Sky, for that amazing film. It's still in my head, rolling around. I wanted to ask you right from the start about language and about the fact that, your film unfolds in the Chinuk Wawa language. And I know that you yourself have spent time learning in Chinook and going on to teach it. So I wondered if you could talk about that life experience, what motivated you to do that, and then why you chose to have the film be in the Indigenous language.
My interest in learning Indigenous language began, I think, when I was a child. I remember my grandmother ordering Ho-Chunk teaching materials, language materials, when I was, 8, 9, 10. And it was a difficult learning because I was living in California at the time. It was difficult learning the language so far away from fluent speakers. And it was just something that fell to the wayside. in my early teens, but it was something that I was always interested in or had an awareness of. And in my last few years of college, I wanted to get my foreign language requirement met with an Indigenous language. I'm also very much like a non-traditional student. It took me like 10 years to get my BA. So it was like in and out of community college, and finally ended up at PSU. And around that time, I had this like idea of like, I want to learn my net language. I want to learn Ho-Chunk. But I was living in Portland, Oregon at the time. And again, distance proved challenging with where Ho-Chunk Nation's about 2,000 miles away in Wisconsin. And through conversations with friends at the Native American Student and Community Center, where I spent a lot of time, a friend introduced me to Evan Gardner, who was teaching Chinuk wawa and a language indigenous to the Portland region. And I met him, and I was just sold the minute that I met him. He developed this sort of language methodology that's very non-traditional, and that kind of blew my mind because it was so much not about the traditional classroom approach to memorizing words and phrases, memorizing nouns, and just like passing tests. But it was more centered on speaking the language in the language, or learning the language in the language without translation, and the idea that you teach the way that you're taught, and how then can you fracture like these different language lessons into small little bite-sized pieces, as he called them, and teach while you learn. And so that way you learn, as you're learning the language, you're also learning how to teach the language. Mm-hmm. And that does a lot for a language that is endangered, that doesn't have a lot of speakers, and doesn't have a lot of teachers as well. And so I started learning Chinuk around the same time that I started making films or videos. This might be a little bit too grandiose to call them films at that point. But I was making work, and I started thinking about how language and film intersect, the ways to express language, indigenous language, through film, through moving image. And that really shaped the way that I started making films in 2010, 2011. And so very much my language learning with Chinuk is tied with my development as a filmmaker, and the ways that I approach movie making, as well as I approach language and teaching. And I mean, like fast forward like 6 or 7 years, and there was at a point in my filmmaking career where I made about 10 short films, more experimental short films, and I wanted to do a feature-length film. And throughout my experimental filmmaking practice, I focus a lot on language, the different ways to explore the powers of subtitles, the power of translation, who's doing the subtitling, who's doing the translation, what choices are being made, and the different ways to look at language and aesthetics of language, and just how those can be applied to express a plethora of different ideologies around indigenous identity. And so as I was thinking about this feature-length film and wanted to make one, it just felt natural to return to Chinuk, to return to Oregon, and to a community and friends that I know and am comfortable with. And so that became the avenue for thinking about this feature-length film, especially as I was, attempting to try something new, but at the same time trying to lean into the comfortable parts of my practice, which are, shooting by myself, with friends, and in a language that I've made a few short films about and with.
I love that phrase. With, you're with the language, and the language is what we see the ocean, but soon we start to hear the voice in Chinuk wawa, and I wanted to ask you a little bit about that voice. And is that for you, when you were thinking about that voice, is it the filmmaker? Is it the voice of myth? Is it both? How should we be thinking about that voice that leads us through your film?
I'd like to think about it as my voice. I think, the first 20 minutes of the film are pretty much like the first 20 minutes that I edited, just to get a sense of how this feels, what I need to shoot, what does this look like together? Because at that point I'd been gathering a lot of footage, but I hadn't really started editing. And so that first 20 minutes is pretty much like the look and feel of the film, mm-hmm. of that first pass. And through that, I realized that I needed or wanted a voiceover, but I wasn't quite sure how to go about it. The idea with the film was to make it entirely in Chinook wawa, but Sweetwater came on board and she doesn't speak Chinook, and so I wanted to, like, you know, account for that and acknowledge that. And so I was thinking about the voiceover as another sort of bridge between Sweetwater and Jordan speaking this different language, and how to approach them flatly without a sense of hierarchy. Like, not to say that, you know, if you're native and you don't speak your native language, that doesn't place you in any sort of hierarchy of judgment around whether you do or not, or you don't. And with that in mind, I was trying to figure out, like, do I write this voiceover in Chinook and then read it? Do I write it in English and translate it? And neither of those approaches felt natural to me. I mean, I'm a better speaker than I am a writer in Chinook, and it just, like, doesn't come naturally to me. So what I ended up doing was just, like, getting my phone and my voice recorder and just, like, watching that first 20 minutes and just talking into my recorder and just saying what I was thinking and saying what I saw and how I was, like, describing them. So that became the approach for doing the voiceover in the film, was just, like, me talking over the footage while I was watching it and thinking about, like, what does this remind me of? What am I thinking about? And just letting the language define itself in that sort of way. And I think even just, like, my referencing Sweetwater and Jordan, you know, as my friends that I've known for so long, and even my voice that you might hear behind the camera as opposed to just in the voiceover itself, are these sorts of, like, implications of me in the construction of this, but also in conversation with them too.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. That's super interesting. Laura, you want to?
Yep. I'd like to talk to you a bit about how you construct time in the film. I know that from some of the reviews I read, people were talking about fragments and fragmentation, which is not how I really saw it. I'm thinking specifically about the images of Jordan and Sweetwater that you keep returning to, walking through the forest, they're back to us. And I think after a few of those, I started thinking about the film as a loop, as a film loop. And I think about how film and video loops really blur the sense of both linear narrative and linear time. And, you know, some video loops just don't have a beginning or end, right? There's just no sense. Others, even if they do have a very set beginning and end, the end is very close to the beginning, right? So there's that sort of abstraction of time. And then when time is abstracted, obviously the narrative becomes very cyclical. Other places in the film use slow-mo, slowing down both the narrative and the time. I have to say, for me, that handheld camera always, like, brings me right into the present. There's just that whole feeling of, you know, being with the camera person and seeing what they see and actually maybe even feeling what they feel. So it seems like you're really leveraging the tools and techniques of digital cinema, slowing down, the lightness of the camera, the loop, to deal with time. So I just was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there is a logic to the film and through its structure, but it's like it's an intuitive logic. It's nothing that I mapped out, but it's just like I felt a certain freedom to move these different sections around, these different scenes and sequences around to places that made sense to me in terms of the story, in terms of the development, and in terms of the references that are found throughout. Like Sweetwater in the beginning of the film is talking about something that happens at the end of the film, and with, like, the waterfall, and just, like, small little things like that, or just these sorts of ways that I don't feel beholden to a linear sort of narrative, and, like, these questions of returning, these questions of time, and these questions of cycles pop up throughout, especially with moments like, visually, I think of the film as a sort of, like, a coil, you know, or a spiral, or a loose spiral that, like, overlaps on top of itself as it is progressing or moving through space. Maybe it's like a helix, I'm not sure. But I'm going to find out one day what that shape is. But still, like, it's about these cycles, and Sweetwater and Jordan both talk about that. I mean, Jordan with his hair, you know, talking about the old ways and, like, living in a way that is in honor of his ancestors, and same with Sweetwater, this idea of reincarnation and rebirth in this one certain space. But at the end of the film, they're also talking about escaping certain cycles, hoping that their children don't fall into some of the cycles that are part of the complicated idea or being a Native person in this country. Sweetwater too, just, like, you know, thinking about her grandmother and the relationship she had with her and how she understood her, and just, like, hoping to break cycles with her daughter. And so it's just like it's a complicated tension between just, like, not necessarily, like, cycles that repeat themselves, loops that repeat themselves, but rather loops and cycles that change and shift and I guess like move outward, you know, with still a recollection and acknowledgement of the past, but also just this idea of the future and what's possible.
Yeah, and I'm also interested, I mean, maybe that this follows up on this. I'm a big fan of your short films and the visual language that you develop in your short films. I show them in class, and I sort of think that if I saw a short film by you, that I could recognize it if it was one that I hadn't seen before. But the visual language here, I see echoes of it, but it's also different. And I was wondering if you could talk about the different strategies that you employed and why.
Yeah, I mean, like I like to change things up with each short film. I mean, I average 2 a year and a half since 2013 or 2014, actually 2013 actually. And so there's a different, I mean, I try to challenge myself not to do the same thing, or if I do the same thing, to do it to a different effect or for a different purpose and intent. I mean, like part of that like might help create a visual language or a certain language around the films, but also just not feeling beholden to a certain pattern and a certain freedom to use these different cinematic techniques as tools that can be applied in different situations to different effects in different films. And even like things that I get or use from, you know, the canon of experimental filmmaking or friends or conversations that I have, and just like how then these formal gestures can be references to other films, but also be part of an experimental film tradition that I'm continuing, and hopefully can be continued on by others that might see the work and feel inspired by something that I might do, or find a use for it in their own work in some sort of way. It's like I do not feel a sense of propriety around anything in these films. Like I think that's all up for grabs, and it's all up for conversation to be used and to be in dialogue with filmmakers in the present and in the future. And with this film, when I film people, I tend to not do a lot of visual abstractions or abstracting them, I think out of respect, or just like out of some sort of like barrier in my head. It's either like full-on abstraction, or it's just like, you know, clean images. And with this film, I didn't feel the impulse to do a lot of visual abstractions, so I sort of challenged myself to try and do everything in camera that I did. And a lot of that is like shooting down to slow frame rates or shooting down to slow shutter speed, and really just leaning into the color correction and into the to the soundscape as a different form of abstraction, or to sort of underscore the artificiality of these images and how they can then take a mythical sort of a place in terms of this conversation around mythology and where do myths fit today.
Yeah, the soundscape is amazing to me. Just that whole elongated segment where the paddle is hitting the water and it sounds like a heartbeat or a drum beat, but then at other points in the film, the drum is silent. I mean, just the use of audio is really amazing. I actually, if it's okay with the both of you, I actually wanted to go to a question, because there's a question in the chat that I think relates to some of the things we're talking about around slow-mo sound and what the audience member is calling a floating, drifting camera, which I like that description. Is there something about the theme of the spirits of the dead in this way of making these scenes? Does the technique support the content, illustrate the content?
I think so. I think that's what I'm trying to do. I mean, like I made a short film called I'll Remember You As You Were, Not As What You'll Become. And in that I do a lot of like heavy visual abstractions to sort of like mimic this sort of space of powwow dancers, but as this idea of the spirit world. And with this film as well, like, I mean, I wanted to try and blur those lines between sort of like, you know, the ethereal plane and reality, the spirit world and the place that we live, and to kind of collapse them into a single space. I mean, I think a lot about Pechepang Sethakul's film Uncle Bumi, Who Can Recall His Past Lives, and the treatments of the dead and the treatment of these spirits as real, as present. And I wanted to do the same with this film, to not treat it as something spectacular, but, you know, just what are these sort of things that I can do with the camera and with my editing and with the montage to acknowledge that sort of place, or to invite that sort of interpretation into the work.
And then maybe just another follow-up question from the audience. A question about the underwater sequences in the film. Was there anything that you had to leave out of the film during production that you wish that you had kept in?
The underwater sequence was shot in a river in Wisconsin. I had a GoPro. I think I just got the GoPro, and I was in an inner tube when I was floating down the river, and I was just filming behind me. And like I like that footage. I mean, I like the grass, and I also like this little acknowledgement of my homelands, because my tribes are from Wisconsin. My tribe is from Wisconsin on my dad's side. And so it's just like, it felt nice to kind of introduce the beginning of the film post the title card, to an acknowledgement of a place that I'm coming from and that I'm from. And yeah, I don't know, there's something about the grass and the water that I really thought was beautiful. And there wasn't really anything that I left out of the film during production. I think I filmed about 10 hours total, maybe 7 to 10 hours total. And a lot of that was just like more longer durations of the long takes I was shooting. But for the most part, everything that I felt like was going to be in the film ended up in the film.
The sound is really also under the water. I was wondering how you did that, because that's really captivating.
I think the GoPro, actually, I was like on a canoe paddling during the canoe journey, and I attached the GoPro to a paddle. And so I was like, you know, paddling with the GoPro and just trying to make sure it got in the water. So that's like where that sounds comes from.
I know that you mentioned that Jordan and Sweetwater are longtime friends, and I mean, there's definitely an intimacy that you can feel in the conversations. I just was wondering, were you using a typical documentary format, question and answer with them? Was it more of a conversation? Were they offering up comments themselves? How did that relationship, especially between longtime and close friends, work?
Actually, I mean, again, like pretty much like what you see in the film in terms of the interviews is what we interviewed. It was pretty sparse, and I think that goes to my own sort of reluctance to engage in that sort of like formal interview, like with this project. Like I have before, like especially when I was first started out learning how to shoot. I mean, I do a lot of like not promo videos, but like what is it called? But like films for like nonprofits, like native nonprofits around Portland, like, you know, art spaces around Portland, and just like talking at interviews like for promo purposes. And I've done a number of films like where I do longer interviews, but like with this film, pretty much I wanted to try to like, you know, just record us as we were, as though we had a camera and a microphone in front of us, you know? So just like acknowledging the sort of strangeness of the space and the style of interview, but also just like not thinking too much about it. I think when the interview where Sweetwater is talking about reincarnation and her grandmother's death, we were actually like driving to a waterfall that she wanted to show me. And I was driving the car and she was holding the microphone in the passenger seat, talking into it. And we're just like talking about death and her family and all that stuff. And so there's a certain informal quality to it. And I mean, I guess, you know, it's not recommended to record interviews in a car while driving. But there was something to that space. It was just like, we're driving to this waterfall. It's raining out. It's kind of, it's pretty outside in that sort of Pacific Northwest kind of way. And it just felt natural. And so it's the kind of approach that I leaned into.
That I think we have a question from the audience also that kind of follows up on that. Has the making of this film changed your own relationship with the notion of death?
I mean, I think I make this film because my relationship with death is changing, and I have a lot of questions around it. I mean, like that film that I mentioned, I'll Remember You As You Were, not as what you'll become, from 2016, I believe. It's a short film that I made about, you know, not so much about, but just like a sort of meditation on Ho-Chunk ideas of reincarnation and the afterlife. And I have a long-standing interest in theology, as well as just like, you know, indigenous belief, my beliefs, my tribe's belief outside of a Christian context, away from a Christian context on its own terms. And like I use film as a way to explore those ideas and what it means to me. And very much with this film, which I was drawn to the origin of death myth as a way to, I don't know, like see some sort of familiarity or kinship with my own tribal beliefs in this one, Chinookan beliefs, and a way to talk about these stories or talk about these questions in a way that isn't so much about trying to retell an origin of death myth, but rather looking at the effects that it has on people today that live in the shadow, but just in front of, in the future of that origin of death myth. And so I think that, yeah, like, I mean, I'm probably going to make more works about these questions, about my beliefs and like where that fits in, because film is the medium that I choose to ask those questions and to talk about these things more so than, I think, like academic writing or something.
So here's another question from the audience. What is your relationship between audio, visual, video creation, and activism? So do you see your work or any of your past work in terms of activism?
I mean, that's like it's a very broad and a very specific way that I think about like activism. I mean, being alive and making work is a statement, you know, like being a Native person, like in these spaces that aren't meant for us, aren't designed for us, and we're not welcomed in is a statement. Like making work about Ho-Chunk belief in reincarnation, Chinookan belief in reincarnation is a statement, because no one is asking us to do this. And for the longest time, they've been telling us not to do this. Like we weren't allowed to practice our own religions until like what, the 70s, you know, and getting support to like save our language in the 90s, getting our things back with NAGPRA in the 90s, you know, it's just like, it's like every indigenous breath and step and gesture and movement is a form of activism, I believe. And I think that also is an invitation for things to go beyond this sort of spectacle of activism that is often associated with like BIPOC-led movements. You know, it's just like there's more to us than getting beaten up by police or by FBI agents or the traumas that define us to a Western and to a white audience. So I think that as long as we keep on expanding this idea of indigeneity and asserting our culture and our presence on our own terms for ourselves, like that's activism. And I think those gestures and those movements should be as supported as fully as people that supported Standing Rock and that continue to support resistance against pipelines. There's a big, broad idea of like what it means to be indigenous, and I'm all for expanding that idea because we've been asked to, or been told not to do that for so long.
And I think that the lyrical qualities of your film and the experimental qualities of your film are expanding the notion maybe of what we would think of as activism as well. Bringing it away from maybe video witnessing, straight ahead video witnessing, or documentary into another and new visual language as well. So another question. I was strongly reminded of essay films watching your film. Your film is more than an essay film, though. It's very lyrical, especially your voiceover. How do you think about how a filmmaker can be creative and poetic in a film that is nonfiction?
I think it's the best place to be creative and poetic. I mean, I kind of like this sort of deficit-based idea of like nonfiction. So it's just like something that isn't fiction, you know. It's like it's so expansive and it's so broad. It's also the reasons why I like experimental film, is because like in the truest sense of the word, it's an experiment, it's a test. And if you lean into those tests and you lean into those questions and you lean into those propositions, there's certain, you know, constraints that pop up that you might find for yourself. But there's also ways that you can lean into these sorts of the poetic aspect of it. You know, I'm not trying to tell like a story in a 3-act structure or a 5-act structure. I'm not trying to make a talking head documentary that is, you know, trying to, you know, be a call to arms for this or that. I'm just like using this format, this nonfiction approach, this experimental approach to write poems and to make things that, you know, I'm uncertain about, or if they'll land or if they make sense, because I can. And I think there's a certain freedom to that I think really invites these different forms. And I don't know, like, I mean, like, I don't know if like I came to an experimental scene like when it wasn't cool to like make things that are pretty, but I've always been resistant to the baggage that experimental film has, you know. So I don't know. I think that there's a lot of things to be challenged around these essentialized ideas that we have of what these things are, and I think really just kind of leaning into one's own personal aesthetics and in a challenging way, in a generative way, in a way that's about growing. I think that's. I think that these spaces are ripe for the creative and the poetic.
I like this notion of coming into experimental film when it was not cool for it to be pretty. I understand what you're saying. And I think that, I think again, to like talk about the, reading about this particular film there is such a focus on being lost in the image and the lushness of the image, and the beauty of the image. So I think there's a lot to be said for that personal aesthetic and that personal approach.
Actually, there's a quote by, I think Mercier, who wrote this book about Bela Tarr. Yeah, it's I have it like in my notes because I always think about it, but this is Mercier talking about Bela Tarr's work, and he writes, "The beauty of images never an end. It is only the reward for fidelity to the reality that one wants to express and to the means that one employs in doing so." And I really like take that to heart, just like not making something that is aesthetically pleasing just for the sake of it, but how can this function to build a world or build an idea that is further complicated by what you see and what you hear and what you experience and where it sits in an edit. Like that's the thing that makes something beautiful.
I think that makes me think about the extended portions of the film, like the extended dance sequence, or again, that sequence, that paddling sequence where there's sort of like a break or a rest from the conversation. But they're really important to me, like contextualizing elements, bringing you, for example, to the land, or bringing you to the community. Can you talk about those sequences a little bit, those sort of extended sequences, and how you see them working in the film?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it does start with, I mean, again, to reference Bela Tarr, like, I mean, Workmeister Harmonies is a film that has like, it's like 3 hours long and has like 36 cuts, And I've always been interested in like the long take. And I've always like found it challenging to deal with the short films or just like justify their placement or their existence within the short film. So with this film, I knew that I wanted to do a lot of long takes to see how it functions. And I figured if anything, all I need is like 7, 10-minute long takes and I got a film, So it's a great place to start. And it's just like with those moments where I found myself feeling there was this sort of success in the shot, or just like it was doing something that I wanted it to do, was with those sequences, like with the paddling. This movement along a boat and watching, anticipating where the boat's going to go as we're following these canoes with me and my camera, and also this sort of like industrial space or post-industrial space along the Columbia River. And with the dance sequence, like in films, I always like the sort of breaks or turns that a film might take away from its main story. And it's just like a sort of like pause, or it's sort of a rest. It's sort of just like a distraction that comes in. And I didn't think of this sequence as a distraction, but rather just as a pause and a break to acknowledge that something is happening, and now it's time to pay attention to it, and to think about where you sit in a place of the camera and behind the camera, as an audience member, as what is happening unfolds before you. And up to that point, I'd been pretty resistant, or just like not fully given an audience like the sound and the image together. Like you might see drumming with an abstracted soundscape. You might see the drumming with a further, like a somewhat abstracted or reverby type of audio space. And this is like the first sequence where it's just like you see the drumming and you hear the drumming and you hear the singing and you see the dancing. And it just felt like a reprieve from the sort of like questions of life and death of the film, I suppose. Well, the song is called New Beginnings. And I don't know, just like I just like that sort of space of like, this is what I'm seeing and this is what I'm sharing with you as an audience that might not have access to this vantage point.
It's so interesting to think about. I was thinking about the scenes of the dancing and the powwow, and how you really resist anything like a kind of objective documentary like gaze there. Like, let's look at how, as you might see in an ethnographic film. It's like, it's part of how you create that pause and that reflection, is that you're not looking at, you're sort of, you're positioned very differently vis-a-vis the sound and the image. I thought that was super interesting.
And I also like the notion of a pause, because again, it's that notion of playing with time and playing with linear time, right? Rather than just action, 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 this time to pause and reflect. And as you said, expose the audience to something that they might not have seen. So, we have some more questions about language. Could you talk a little bit more? I mean, last week we watched Night Raiders by Dennis Goulet. I don't know if you've had a chance to see it or not yet.
Yeah.
Great film. There's this real sort of dignity around the way that she's using the Cree language. It's just presented. She doesn't feel like there has to be any context for it. People obviously are code switching in the film. They're going back and forth between Cree and English. Again, like that's what they're doing. That's natural to the conversation and to the narrative of the film. There's parts of your film where the language isn't translated into subtitles. And so could you talk a little bit about that decision?
Yeah, I mean, like there's like loose translations for these words, but they're often like imperfect. And I am drawn to the imperfect and the ambiguous, especially when it comes to language or things that can't be translated. And like, I think Kwan is like one of those words, and like Tluskagwa is like Jordan says, is one of those phrases that just like don't translate, but you just like know what they mean, And I wanted to make a point about that, that like not everything is translatable. And if I can do so like in a casual sort of way, just like it seems less like something that, deserves to be questioned or like is seen less as a spectacle of a translation. But just like there's something natural to this, or just like the moving in between these different languages, and as English, as Chinuk, especially as they're presented on screen, sort of flatly. So I mean, there weren't many other places in the film where I wanted to do that, but those were the ones that just like came to mind as something that felt natural.
Mm-hmm.
Great. I just wanted to just switch our focus just for a little bit and see if you might be willing to talk a little bit about the Cousins Collective and the work that you're doing, the collective's doing to promote and support Indigenous film.
Yeah, Cousin Collective started like 3 years ago now. About 3 years. Time flies in a pandemic. It doesn't. But it started because we were trying to find ways to support Indigenous experimental filmmakers in the United States, specifically because there isn't a lot of film support for Indigenous film, let alone Indigenous experimental film. I mean, I felt really alone for the longest time out there in the very white experimental film circuit with, other BIPOC filmmakers out there, but also it's just like there's a need and there's a gap, and there's always someone saying, oh, do you know the other native, Adam Khalil? And for like a few years, like we'd never met each other, but we heard about each other from other people, And so in some ways being like the two natives that we heard about on the circuit or the film festival world or whatever, it just felt like, this is small and how can we support each other? And when we met, we became friends. And it was actually at the Flaherty seminar in 2018, I believe, where me, Khalil, Adam Perone, and Alex Lazarowicz, like we're all the natives there, and we just like hung out and talked, and like I think we're all friends at that point, but we never like hung out together. And we just really got this idea going about how do we support Indigenous filmmakers that are working in experimental film, and how do we build a community out of this? Because another part of, colonization is lateral oppression, and this idea of like wanting to be the token, wanting to be the one native, and fighting to be the token. And there's a lot of like lateral oppression that happens in that sort of way, lateral violence that happens in that sort of way. And we wanted to fight against that and just bring more people into the fold, have more native filmmakers out there that, want to do weird things with the camera and tell stories in their own way. And so that was really how the Cousin Collective was born, is to try to build and foster that community and to find those filmmakers that might be getting rejected from all like, the big native film funding organizations because their project is a little too weird, or they might not be able to describe it perfectly, but they have a vision of it. And so we were able to support 10 filmmakers, or 11 total actually, in 2020, and with varied amounts of like financial support to their projects. And that was just before the pandemic hit, or just as the pandemic hit. So it kind of like changed some of our plans around some gatherings we were hoping to do. But where we're at right now is like working on a collection of writings about Indigenous experimental film,
Oh.
broad as that might be. And we're looking at how to continue to support the cohort that was in our first cycle and planning for the next one as well. And to continue to try and just, make more space for natives that want to make weird films.
I hadn't realized that I knew that you were curating films, and I had seen an online presentation of films that you had curated. I hadn't realized that you were funding films, which is amazing, until doing research for this film festival. And we're showing St. Anne as part of the film festival. And so I'm just in awe of the fact that you're committed to also funding films, as well as curating and traveling film packages as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like even trying to follow like a more artistic support model as opposed to a film production model. It's like we're not looking for percentage points, or a return, or a shooting schedule. It's like, how can you just put money in the hands of the filmmakers, like a lot of artist organizations do, and just make work, pay your bills, do what you need to do to make the space, whether that's with equipments, whether that's with buying food and paying rent. Whatever you can do to just survive as an artist, because it's hard. I know.
Okay. There is a question here that just came in about that, since you mentioned the Flaherty, that someone wants to know how you might be approaching your role as programmer at the Flaherty this summer.
That's a great question. I'm actually I'm co-programming with Almudena Escobar Lopez. And I'm actually at her house right now, and we're planning on doing some programming work tonight and tomorrow.
We hear a laugh there.
And so yeah, we're just really trying to think about how to be deliberate and intentional with this, but also just poetic, and not necessarily trying to do something that's is about us and our vision, but rather what are these works and how do they fit together with this broader idea of an international, not necessarily indigenous, but just response to making work together within one's own different sort of social, cultural, political confines of their home. I don't say confines, but just within the lands that they exist and the lands that they live. And how can that be a guiding point for then bringing these filmmakers together and really just getting out of the way? I think that's a big part of programming, is how can you just get out of the way and let the people that you're programming have their voice and do what they need to do.
Yeah. Yes, that's the difficult part. So is there anything that you want us to know about the film, a question that you're never asked about the film, something that you'd like to share?
Is there anything? I don't know. I don't know. It's a very personal film. I mean, I think most of my films are, like I said, I mean, I'm just not the kind of filmmaker that does documentary that just goes to try to get the shot, or just puts a microphone in someone's face and says, tell me your life story. I like working with people that I know and people that I trust, and I like for them to trust me too. And I think that's a big part of just the way that I make films. It's with friends, it's with family. And I think there's a mutual respect there. And I think there has to be. I try to show the work to as many people as I can when I get a first cut going, especially people that are in the film, to make sure that they're happy with how they're being presented and how they're being represented. Because for so long, we haven't had that agency to choose how we're presented on screen. And I don't know, I think that I feel I mean, when it comes to weird abstractions of a landscape, I'm following my intuition. And same thing with shooting my friends and my family, in these films, is just what feels good about it, what doesn't feel good about it, what should I not film, what should I film? Those are all things that guide how I film and guide how I edit and how I approach these different projects. Because they're very subjective, there's nothing journalistic or objective about them. These are my interpretations of these experiences, and I want to be held accountable for that. And I don't really want to be an authority on anything other than my own experience. Mm-hmm. Not speaking for the natives, but rather I'm hoping to be part of a larger conversation and a larger dialogue with other Native filmmakers that are out here asking these questions, or asking questions that I haven't even thought to ask. And I think that that's really exciting about a project like this, is not so much what it does, but just like the possibilities that it invites.
Well, building on that, it seems like you've inspired one of our audience members who asked, what would you say or like to share to young people who want to make video art similar to yours?
I think just like make a lot of work and don't be afraid of the edit. I mean, I feel like yeah, it's like you have to make a lot of bad work, but you have to respect that bad work, you know? I think you have to always respect the work that you're making, but like don't fall in love with it, you know? It's like a balance, you know? Just like you can like really like love what you're doing and love how it looks, but you have to be open to critique and feedback and being honest with yourself. I think just like making a lot of work also demystifies the process. You get used to importing, logging, editing, exporting, you know, just next project. So I just like think like make a lot of work, respect what you're doing, respect the work, but don't fall in love with it. And there's something that I like to do too in the editing process is called like, I call it like the honesty cut, where if there's a sequence that I just really want it to work, but deep down I know that like it doesn't work, I'll copy the timeline, make a new edit and cut things out and cut it down like by 5 minutes or whatever. And if I watch it through and I feel like, you know what, this is right. I'm being honest with myself. This sequence that I love is just too long. It's too self-indulgent. It's too whatever. It's got to go. Like that's like really good practice to getting a sense of a balance between the things that you love and the things that need to be there and the things that don't need to be there.
And, you know, and I think that your notion of personal filmmaking extends to the fact that you're doing camera, you're editing, right? You're taking on all these roles. So sort of a one-man band, but your own vision is really apparent in all of those different aspects. So another question about the film. There's a motif of something like doorways or openings to some other place. Behind the waterfall, for example, or through the rock formation on the shoreline towards the end of the movie. These felt like they were really some way through to somewhere real. That was really impactful. So more like a comment.
Yeah, I hate to do this, but it's some ways it kind of goes back to John Ford, the frame within the frame, you know? I mean, there's just something about like the way that a frame exists within a frame in terms of a landscape or in terms of like movement, in terms of progression. Like for me, a lot of that is just the way to compositionally look at a space, to look at movement, to look at where people sit and and what we're moving towards. Like she that last sequence when we're walking to that rock formation with a hole in it, like I had no idea what was there. I was just like shooting and trying to like, you know, find the frame and find the composition and just like anticipate what was going to happen. And it's just like, that was like one of those sequences. As soon as I shot it, I was like, okay, this is the end of the film. Because it offers this support and bolster that question of the film about life and death and sort of like space in between these different realms and finding things visually that supports like a more conceptual idea of what the film is about. I think are things that I often look for in my editing and my shooting as I'm doing these things.
Yeah, the frame within a frame. I have to say that towards the beginning of the film, when I saw the iPhone in Jordan's car, I mean, it brought me back to Dislocation Blues, you know, and that whole notion of framing and reframing the image. What was the woman's on her T-shirt? Something like
strong resilience, indigenous.
Yes. I mean, I think to me, it really said that you were also going to be giving us a different framing of the image of Indigenous people in this film. But, you know, and just seeing that over and over again, doorways, like the question mentions, cameras coming up again at the dance. It's just this sort of really beautiful echo throughout the film. So we have a few more minutes. Jackie, do you have any other questions, comments?
Not right at this second, no.
So how about some closing thoughts? You know, I'd like to hear like what's next from you, what this experience of making a feature-length film. Are we still going to be seeing short films from you?
I mean,
feature-length films.
I mean, I'm just like, yeah, I've been talking about that or thinking about that a lot recently. I mean, I've also like started to move more into, I guess, like the gallery world, like with multi-channel installations and seeing the way the short works function in a gallery space. And I like it. I like the cinema. I love the cinema. But I also love the opportunity to view things and to view things repeatedly, you know, for a month or 2 months or however long an exhibition might be open. And I'm also like working on a feature-length film right now that I'm hoping to shoot at the end of the summer around powwows and powwow culture. It's a culture that I grew up with as my mom was a dancer, my dad was a drummer, and I grew up dancing too. And so I've been thinking about that for a long time. And so we're in the mid stages of pre-production right now. It obviously got pushed back a bit because of COVID, but we're hoping to get something going as far as the shooting, a bulk of it this summer, and just seeing where that goes. So yeah, I'm leaning more towards like the photography that I'm doing, the things that I'm writing, and the features that I've been dreaming about. And there's always going to be a place in my heart for short film. It's just, I mean, I average like 2 a year, and it's just like if I don't make something, then it just feels like I'm not doing anything, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And you have an exhibition up right now.
Yes.
Or opening soon, right? In Rochester, you have an exhibition?
Yeah. Yeah, it opened last month-ish, or a few weeks ago. Yeah, a few weeks ago. And I think it's open up into June, I believe. January next year.
And could you just share with the audience what the work is about that's in the exhibition?
Yeah, there's a 3-channel video installation called Here You Are Before the Trees, and it's a film that I made for the Hessel or Bard CCS show that I had in November of 2020 about the Hudson River Valley and my place within it. The Stockbridge Munsee, who are indigenous to the region, were relocated to Wisconsin, right next to my traditional homelands, near Wittenberg, Wisconsin. And so there's this sort of like idea of diaspora between their movements to Wisconsin and mine to this region, and as well as just a speech by Vine Deloria, actually given at Amherst in the 70s, I believe. And Renier Ramirez talking about this idea of the native hub, which goes against or counters these anthropological notions that to remove natives from the land they're on is to remove their identity, and which is not the case. And some poetry from Adrian C. Lewis, and text from John Quinney, who was the chief of the Stockbridge Munsee, in a speech that he gave in 1859, I believe, 1850s. Basically just like, you know, expressing his displeasure with the US government and their treatment of the tribe. So all those different elements like function in this film, Here You Are Before the Trees, or this 3-channel piece. And there's a larger photo that I did with text etching, as well as some of the calligrams that I do with text that are put into the shape of effigy mounds, which are found in Wisconsin, which my ancestors built.
Well, thank you so much. Looking forward to more work by you. Looking forward to seeing your work in galleries and museums on exhibition. Appreciate you sharing your time with us. Jackie, thank you as well. And thank you to the audience for your questions.
Thank you so much. Really beautiful.
Well, thank you, Jackie Urla and Laura McGough, for leading this really wonderful conversation tonight. Many thanks again to Sky Hopinka for your quietly powerful and really engaging film, and for joining us tonight to talk about it. My thanks to Nefeli Forni Serbudaki, Assistant Curator of the MMFF, the hard work of Ian Sedlow, Film Studies Program Manager, and our festival interns, Kaya Leibowitz, Lucy Saint-Sauveur, Yang Yi Chen, Shen Yu Wu, Ryan Curtis, and Samuel Cove makes this festival happen. Thanks also to our audience. As always, this week's film, Botany Toward the Ocean, Towards the Shore, will remain available on demand via our website tonight, so you can see it again or see it for the first time if you haven't seen it yet. I highly recommend it. It's a pleasure also just to acknowledge our sponsors who make the festival possible. At UMass Amherst, the College of Humanities and Fine Art, the UMass Arts Council, the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, and special thanks to the 5 College Film and Media Council and the 5 College Native American and Indigenous Studies Fund provided by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. Please see our website for more information about the festival and upcoming events, blogs.umass.edu, MMFF 2022. The MMFF is presented by the Film Studies program at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Barbara Zecchi, Film Studies Director. Thank you.